Have you ever wondered how people saw the world before satellites and GPS? Long before we had Google Maps in our pockets, brave explorers and skilled cartographers pieced together the globe, one hand-drawn line at a time. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. Tonight, we're diving into the fascinating world of Renaissance map-making, a story of art, science, and bold adventure. Let's rewind to the 14th century. Europe was just emerging from the Middle Ages. Most world's maps, known as Mappa Mundi, were more symbolic than scientific. They were often circular, with Jerusalem at the center, and filled with biblical stories and mythical creatures. They weren't meant for navigation. They were visual encyclopedias of religious and classical knowledge. Imagine a world where dragons and sea monsters were as real on a map as a distant city. That was the reality. But change was on the horizon, and it came from the sea. Maritime trade was booming, especially in the Mediterranean. Sailors from Venice, Genoa, and Catalonia needed practical charts to navigate from one port to another. This gave rise to the Portolan chart. Unlike the Mappa Mundi, Portolan charts were incredibly practical and surprisingly accurate for their time. They were drawn on vellum, a type of animal skin, and were characterized by a web of crisscrossing lines called rum lines. These lines radiated from compass roses, helping sailors plot a straight line course, or a rum, from point A to point B. Using a magnetic compass, the coastlines on these charts were meticulously detailed, based on first-hand accounts and centuries of sailing experience. They showed harbors, anchorages, and coastal hazards. However, if you looked inland, the details vanished. These were charts for sailors, by sailors. The open ocean was still a vast, terrifying unknown. The game changer came in the early 15th century. A manuscript by an ancient Greek scholar named Claudius Ptolemy was rediscovered and translated into Latin. His work, Geographia, written around 150 AD, was a revelation. Ptolemy wasn't just describing places. He was providing a system to map them. He introduced the idea of a grid system of latitude and longitude, a method for projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface. This was revolutionary. For the first time, Renaissance scholars had a scientific framework for creating a world map. Suddenly, maps weren't just collections of sailors' observations. They were mathematical constructions. Early printed maps based on Ptolemy's work began to circulate, sparking immense public interest. Of course, Ptolemy's data was ancient and had its own errors. His map of the world was too small and showed the Indian Ocean as a landlocked sea. But the method, the very idea of a coordinate system, was the key that would unlock the world. And unlock it, they did. The late 15th and early 16th centuries became the age of discovery. Armed with better ships, the compass, and the dream of new trade routes, explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan set sail into the unknown. Every voyage returned with new information, new coastlines, and new islands that had to be added to the map. Cartography became one of the most dynamic and crucial fields of the era. Map-making workshops, especially in places like Portugal, Spain, and later Antwerp, were hives of activity. Information was a valuable, often secret, commodity. The Spanish had the Padrón Real, and the Portuguese had the Padrão Real master maps that were constantly updated with the latest discoveries. These were state secrets, jealously guarded to maintain a competitive edge in the race for empire and trade. Let's look at one of the most famous maps from this period, The 1507 World Map by Martin. Why is it so special? It was the very first map to label the newly discovered lands to the west as America in honor of the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose writings convinced Walt Miller that this was a new continent, not just the eastern edge of Asia. Imagine the audacity, naming an entire continent. This map was a turning point, a definitive statement that the world was much, much larger than anyone in Europe had previously believed. As the 16th century progressed, mapmaking became a major commercial enterprise. The center of cartography shifted north to the Low Countries, particularly Antwerp. This is where we meet the rock star of Renaissance mapmaking, Gerardus Mercator. You've probably heard of the Mercator projection. In 1569, Mercator created a revolutionary world map. His goal was to create a chart where a sailor could plot a course of constant bearing as a straight line. This was a huge advantage for navigation over long distances. The trade-off, which we still see today, is that his projection massively distorts the size of land masses as you move away from the equator. Greenland looks bigger than Africa, which is wildly inaccurate, but for its intended purpose, ocean navigation, it was a stroke of genius. It's a perfect example of how the function of a map dictates its form. Another giant of this era was Abraham. In 1570, he published the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, or Theatre of the World. This is widely considered the first true modern atlas. Ortelius gathered the best available maps from different cartographers, re-engraved them in a consistent style and size, and bound them together in a book. He also included a source list, acknowledging the cartographers whose work he used. It was an instant bestseller, published in numerous editions and languages for over a century. For the first time, a wealthy merchant or scholar could hold the entire known world in their hands, all in one convenient volume. These atlases weren't just geographical tools, they were status symbols and works of art. The maps were beautifully engraved and often hand-colored. The borders were decorated with intricate designs, illustrations of native peoples, exotic animals, ships, and sea monsters. These decorative elements, or cartouches, weren't just filler. They conveyed information, or what was believed to be information, about these distant lands. They reflected the wonder, the curiosity, and also the biases of the European worldview. Looking at these maps, you can feel the excitement and the anxiety of an era that was rapidly expanding its horizons. By the beginning of the 17th century, the pace of discovery had started to slow, but the refinement of maps continued. The Dutch, especially the Blaeu and Jansenius families in Amsterdam, took over as the masters of cartography. Their grand atlases, like the Atlas Major, were the most lavish and comprehensive geographical works of the time, often running to more than 10 volumes. The coastlines of Africa, Asia, and the Americas were now charted with impressive accuracy. Australia, then known as New Holland, began to appear on world maps, though its eastern coast remained a mystery. However, the interiors of the great continents Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Australia remained largely blank. These empty spaces on the map were a silent invitation to future generations of explorers. The work was far from over. The maps of the Renaissance tell a powerful story. They trace Europe's journey from a closed, inward-looking world to a global power. They blend medieval myth with scientific inquiry, artistic beauty with practical navigation. They are a record of human courage, ambition, and our unending quest to understand our place in the world. The next time you effortlessly pinch and zoom on a digital map, take a moment to remember these paper pioneers who, with ink, paper, and incredible bravery drew the world for the very first time. We're journeying back in time, not just to any era, but to the heart of the Renaissance, the 15th century. It was a time of explosive creativity of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and a radical shift in how humanity saw itself and the universe. While we often think of the great art and architecture, there was another revolution quietly unfolding, one that was aimed at the heavens. This was the age when the tools to map the cosmos began to evolve, setting the stage for the astronomical giants like Copernicus and Galileo who would follow. So, grab your virtual telescope and let's explore the incredible astronomical instruments of the 15th century. Before we dive into the specific gadgets, let's set the scene. The 15th century was still firmly in the grip of the Ptolemaic model idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. All the planets and the sun revolved around us in complex, perfect circles. The job of an astronomer wasn't to question this model, but to refine it, to make more accurate predictions of planetary positions, eclipses, and the timing of religious holidays. The Church was the primary patron of astronomy, not for the sake of pure science, but for practical needs like calendar reform. Accuracy was everything, and better instruments were the key to achieving it. So, what was in the 15th century astronomer's toolkit? Let's start with the undisputed king of astronomical instruments. For over 1,000 years, the astrolabe. If you think of a smartphone for a medieval astronomer, you're not far off. This beautiful, intricate brass device was a multi-tool. It was a handheld model of the universe. By aligning its moving parts, you could tell the time of day or night, identify stars, predict their rising and setting, and even determine your latitude. In an age before reliable clocks, the astrolabe was a godsend. Craftsmen in places like Nuremberg, Germany, became masters at engraving these instruments with incredible precision. Each astrolabe was a work of art, a marriage of science and metalwork, and a status symbol for any educated person. Next up, we have the quadrant. Picture a quarter of a circle, usually made of wood or brass, with degrees marked along its curved edge. It had a plumb liner string with a weight hanging from the corner. To use it, an astronomer would sight a star along one of the straight edges, and the plumb line would indicate the star's altitude or its height above the horizon. Simple, yet effective. But 15th century astronomers weren't satisfied with simple. They built enormous versions called mural quadrants and fixed them to the walls of their observatories. The bigger the quadrant, the more precise the degree markings, and the more accurate the measurement. Imagine a massive stone and brass instrument permanently built into a wall, dedicated solely to measuring the heavens. It was a serious commitment to precision. Another crucial instrument was the armillary sphere. This was a physical, 3D model of the cosmos. It consisted of a set of nested interlocking rings, each representing a key circle of the celestial sphere, like the ecliptica, sun's patha, celestial equator, and the tropics. At the center, a small sphere represented the Earth in line with the Ptolemaic view. By adjusting the rings, an astronomer could visualize the complex motions of the stars and planets. It was a teaching tool, a calculating device, and a stunning piece of scientific sculpture all in one. It helped astronomers and students alike to literally get their hands on the universe, to understand the geometry of the cosmos in a tangible way. Now, let's talk about something called this is a bit of a lesser-known gem, but it was incredibly clever. The torquitum was like a mashup of an astrolabe and an armillary sphere, designed to solve a specific problem, converting between different celestial coordinate systems. Think of it like being able to instantly switch between a street address and GPS coordinates. It allowed an astronomer to measure a star's position in one system and immediately know its coordinates in another, which was a huge time saver for calculations. It was a complex device, a testament to the sophisticated mechanical and mathematical minds of the era. And we can't forget about the cross staff, also known as Jacob's staff. This was a more portable tool, especially popular with navigators at sea, but also used by astronomers. It was a simple D-shaped instrument. The user would hold the long staff to their eye and slide the crosspiece until its ends lined up with the horizon and the star they were measuring. By reading a skill on the main staff, they could determine the angle. It was less precise than a big quadrant, but was invaluable for its portability. It shows that 15th century astronomy wasn't just confined to observatories. It was happening on the decks of ships, exploring the New World. One of the most significant figures of this period was the German astronomer Regi. He wasn't just a user of these instruments. He was an innovator and a promoter. In 1471, he established a printing press and an observatory in Nuremberg, creating one of the first true scientific centers in Europe. He didn't just make observations. He printed and distributed astronomical tables, calendars, and treatises on how to build and use instruments. He was essentially creating the world's first instruction manuals for astronomy. He understood that progress in science depended on sharing knowledge and improving tools. His work helped standardize instruments and techniques across Europe, laying a crucial foundation for the scientific revolution to come. It's important to remember that the telescope had not been invented yet. All of these observations, all this data was collected with the naked eye. This is what makes the achievements of 15th century astronomers so remarkable. Their entire science was based on geometry, meticulous measurement, and mechanical ingenuity. The accuracy they were chasing down to fractions of a degree was pushed to the absolute limit of what was possible without magnification. The vast catalogs of star positions and planetary movements they compiled were the direct result of these magnificent brass and wood instruments. So, why does this matter? Because the data collected with these 15th century tools became the bedrock for the revolution that was to come. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed his heliocentric, or sun-centered model of the universe in the next century, he wasn't just guessing. He was using the precise positional data of the planets, collected over decades by astronomers using astrolabes, quadrants, and armillary spheres. He was trying to find a simpler, more elegant mathematical model that fit the observations better than the old Ptolemaic system. Without the high-quality data from the 15th century, Copernicus's arguments would have been far weaker. The quiet, patient work of these craftsmen and observers, meticulously measuring angles in the night sky, literally paved the way for us to see our true place in the cosmos. These instruments were more than just tools. They were the physical embodiment of a changing worldview. They represented a shift towards empirical evidence, towards the belief that the universe could be understood through measurement and mathematics. Each polished brass ring and carefully scribed grimart was a declaration of faith in human reason. The 15th century was the critical setup, the period when the stage was set, the actors were trained, and the props were built for the epic drama of the scientific revolution. We're journeying back in time to the Renaissance, a period of explosive creativity and intellectual curiosity that completely reshaped Europe. We often think of the stunning art of Michelangelo or the brilliant inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, but there was another revolution happening, one that took place on dissection tables in the halls of universities. This was the rebirth of human anatomy, a field that had been largely stagnant for over 1,000 years. For centuries, European medicine was completely dominated by the teachings of an ancient Roman physician named Galen. Now, Galen was brilliant for his time, but there was one major problem. Roman law forbade the dissection of human bodies, so he based his understanding of human anatomy almost entirely on dissecting animals, like Barbary macaques and pigs. He assumed that what he saw in them would be the same in humans, and for over 1,300 years, his word was law. Medical texts were just copies of his work, and challenging Galen was like challenging gravity itself. But then the Renaissance happened. A new way of thinking, called humanism, began to take hold. It celebrated human potential and emphasized direct observation and experience over blindly accepting ancient texts. This spirit of inquiry began to seep into the universities, particularly in Italy, which was the heart of the Renaissance. Schools in Padua, Bologna, and Pisa became buzzing hubs of intellectual daring. Scholars started to think, what if Galen wasn't entirely right? What if the only way to truly understand the human body is to look inside one for ourselves? This was a radical idea. Dissection was still a highly controversial practice. Entangled with religious and social taboos, the church had complex views on the sanctity of the body, and the public was often fearful and suspicious of what went on in university halls. Procuring bodies for dissection was a grim and difficult business, often relying on executed criminals. These public dissections were major events, sometimes held in specially built anatomical theaters, with students and curious citizens packing the galleries to watch. Imagine the scene. A cold, tiered room, lit by candlelight, with a professor at the center, standing over a body. For the first time, students weren't just reading from a book. They were seeing the intricate reality of human muscles, bones, and organs with their own eyes. Early on, the professor would often sit on a high chair, reading from Galen's text, while a barb, considered a lower-class tradesman, would do the actual cutting. But this was about to change dramatically. Enter a man who would become the father of modern anatomy, Andreas Vesalius. Born in Brussels, Vesalius was a brilliant and ambitious young man who became a professor at the University of Padua. He was not content to sit in a chair and read from an ancient book. He believed in getting his hands dirty. Vesalius performed his own dissections, meticulously exploring every part of the human body. As he did, he realized something shocking. Galen had made hundreds of errors. The human jawbone is one piece, not the like in a dog. The human liver doesn't have 5 lobes like a pig's. The human sternum has 3 parts, not 7 like in a monkey. This was revolutionary. Vesalius was directly challenging over a millennium of established medical doctrine. In 1543, he published his masterpiece, a book called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body. This wasn't just a text. It was an anatomical atlas of breathtaking detail and beauty. The illustrations, created by talented artists from Titian's workshop, were unlike anything seen before. They showed the human body not as a static collection of parts, but as a dynamic, living system. Skeletons posed thoughtfully, and musclemen stood in dramatic landscapes. It was a perfect fusion of science and art, a true product of the Renaissance. The Fabrica changed everything. It set a new standard for medical education. Suddenly, the emphasis was on direct observation and empirical evidence. Vesalius proved that the body itself was the ultimate textbook. His work corrected centuries of misconceptions and laid the foundation for a truly scientific understanding of how we are made. Medical students now had an accurate map of the human body to guide them. This anatomical knowledge was crucial. How can a surgeon operate without knowing precisely where organs are located or how blood vessels run? The discoveries made on the dissection tables of Renaissance universities directly led to improvements in surgery and medicine that would save countless lives in the centuries to come. Of course, Vesalius wasn't alone. Other pioneers made crucial contributions. Geraldo Colombo, who succeeded Vesalius at Padua, was the first to correctly describe pulmonary circulation, the way blood travels from the heart to the lungs and back. Another, Gabriel Falloppio, gave his name to the fallopian tubes after providing the first clear description of them. These anatomists were part of a vibrant community, corresponding with each other, debating their findings, and collectively pushing the boundaries of knowledge. The university wasn't just a place for teaching. It was a crucible for discovery. This new anatomy also had a profound impact on art. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were obsessed with understanding the human form to make their art more lifelike. Leonardo, in particular, conducted his own secret dissections, producing thousands of pages of incredibly accurate anatomical drawings that were centuries ahead of their time. He explored not just the structure, but the function of the body, studying how muscles contract and bones articulate. This cross-pollination between art and science was unique to the Renaissance and produced some of the most iconic images in Western culture. So, the next time you see a detailed medical illustration or hear about a complex surgical procedure, remember where it all began. It started in the universities of the Renaissance with brave and curious individuals who dared to challenge tradition, who weren't afraid to look for themselves, and who, in studying the dead, gave a profound new gift to the living. They replaced dogma with data and gave us the very foundations of modern medicine. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and culture. It was the rebirth of ourselves, in the most literal sense. Now, we're diving into the heart of the Renaissance, a time of incredible art, culture, and, most importantly, groundbreaking scientific discovery. We're going to talk about a man who dared to look up at the stars and completely change our understanding of the universe. Galilei. Before Galileo, the way people saw the cosmos was largely based on the ideas of ancient thinkers like Aristotle and Ptolemy. They believed the Earth was the stationary center of everything, and the sun, moon, and planets all revolved around us in perfect circles. This was the geocentric model, and for over 1,400 years, it was the accepted truth, supported not just by tradition, but by the powerful Catholic Church. It was a neat, orderly, human-centered universe. But, as we'll see, the universe is rarely that simple. Enter the Renaissance, a period of rebirth in Europe from the 14th to the 17th century. This era wasn't just about painting and sculpture. It was a time of questioning, exploration, and a renewed interest in the natural world. People were challenging old assumptions in every field. It was into this intellectually charged atmosphere that Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy, in 1564. He was a brilliant mathematician, a physicist, and an astronomer. But more than anything, he was curious. The story really kicks off around 1609. A new invention had emerged from the Netherlands, the telescope, or as it was then called. Initially, it was a novelty, a tool for seeing distant ships at sea. But in Galileo's hands, it became something much more powerful. He didn't invent the telescope, but he dramatically improved it. His versions could magnify objects up to 20 or even 30 times, far more than any other at the time. And then he did something revolutionary. Instead of pointing it at ships, he pointed it at the night sky. What he saw would shake the foundations of Western thought. First, he looked at the moon. For centuries, celestial bodies were thought to be perfect, smooth, ethereal spheres. But Galileo saw something different. He saw worlds with mountains, valleys, and craters, much like our own Earth. It wasn't a perfect heavenly orb. It was a physical place. This was the first crack in the old world view. If the moon was imperfect and Earth-like, maybe the heavens weren't so different from our world after all. Next, he turned his telescope to the planet Jupiter. What he observed was astonishing. He saw 4 tiny points of light orbiting the giant planet. Night after night, he tracked their movements, realizing they were moons just like our moon orbits the Earth. He named them the Medicean stars after his patrons, the Medici family. But today, we know them as the Galilean moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. This discovery was a bombshell. Why? Because it proved unequivocally that not everything in the universe orbited the Earth. Here were celestial bodies clearly orbiting another planet. This directly contradicted the Ptolemaic model. If Jupiter had its own moons, then the Earth was not the unique center of all motion. This was powerful evidence supporting a different, controversial theory proposed by a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus almost 70 years earlier. Copernicus had suggested a heliocentric model where the Sun was at the center of the solar system and the Earth and other planets revolved around it. His idea was mostly mathematical and lacked hard, observational proof. It was considered a curious but unproven hypothesis. Galileo's discovery of Jupiter's moons provided the first real, tangible evidence that made the Copernican system plausible. But Galileo wasn't done. He observed the phases of Venus. In the old Ptolemaic system, Venus orbits the Earth, always staying between us and the Sun. If that were true, we should only ever see Venus as a crescent, similar to a crescent moon. But Galileo's telescope revealed that Venus goes through a full set of phases, just like our moon does, from a thin crescent to a full disk. This could only happen if Venus was orbiting the Sun, sometimes being on the near side of the Sun from our perspective, and sometimes on the far side. There was simply no way to explain the full phases of Venus in an Earth-centered model. This was the nail in the coffin for the Ptolemaic system. He also turned his telescope to the Sun itself, using a projection method to observe it safely. He saw dark spots on its surface. What's more, he observed these spots moving, which indicated that the Sun itself was rotating on its axis. So, even the Sun, the great celestial lamp, was not a perfect, unchanging orb. It was dynamic, blemished, and in motion. Galileo published his initial findings in 1610 in a short book called Sidereus Nuncius, or the Starry Messenger. It caused an immediate sensation across Europe. Many were thrilled, but others were deeply disturbed. These discoveries weren't just about astronomy. They challenged a worldview that had stood for centuries and was deeply intertwined with religious doctrine. If the Earth was not the center of the universe, what did that mean for humanity's special place in creation? The conflict came to a head with the Catholic Church. At first, the Church was intrigued, but as Galileo's arguments for the Copernican system grew stronger and more public, opposition hardened. The Church's theologians argued that a moving Earth contradicted passages in the Bible. In 1616, the Copernican theory was declared foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. Galileo was warned not to hold, teach, or defend the doctrine in any way. For a time, Galileo complied, but in 1632 he published his masterwork, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. He wrote it as a conversation between three characters: one who argues for the Copernican system, one who defends the traditional Ptolemaic view, and an impartial observer. While he claimed it was a balanced debate, it was clear that the character arguing for the old system, named Simplicio, or simpleton, was often made to look foolish. This was a direct challenge to the authority. The Pope, who had once been a friend of Galileo, felt betrayed. In 1633, Galileo, now an old man, was summoned to Rome to face the Inquisition. He was tried for heresy, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to publicly recant his support for the Copernican theory. Legend has it that as he rose from his knees after his recantation, he muttered, "Hyper si move," and yet it moves, referring to the earth. This story is probably not true, but it perfectly captures the spirit of his work. You can force a man to say something, but you can't change the truth. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest, but he never stopped working. He wrote one of his most important books on the science of motion during this time. He died in 1642, the same year Isaac Newton was born. It was as if the torch of science was being passed from one generation to the next. Galileo's legacy is immense. He wasn't just an astronomer. He was a key figure in the birth of the scientific method. He championed the idea that we should rely on observation, experimentation, and evidence, not just ancient authority. His struggle with the Church became a powerful symbol of the conflict between science and dogma, and a story about the importance of intellectual freedom. It took time, but the world eventually caught up with Galileo. In the centuries that followed, the work of scientists like Newton built upon his foundations, cementing the heliocentric model and creating a new physics to explain the motions of the heavens. In 1992, over 350 years after his trial, the Catholic Church formally acknowledged its error and cleared Galileo's name. So, the next time you look up at the night sky, think of Galileo. Think of the courage it took to point that simple tube of glass at the heavens and trust what his own eyes were telling him, even when it contradicted everything he had been taught. He showed us that the universe is far grander and more mysterious than we could have imagined, and that the quest for knowledge is one of humanity's noblest adventures. Have you ever wondered how people told time before smartphones, before digital clocks, even before the little hand on a watch? For most of human history, time was a fluid, natural thing, dictated by the sun rising and setting, the changing seasons. But then something clicked. Literally. During the Renaissance, a revolution in timekeeping began, and it wasn't just about telling the hour. It was about fundamentally changing how we perceive and live our lives. Let's rewind to the late Middle Ages, just before the Renaissance bloomed. Time was public and communal. Huge water clocks, or clepsydras, and sundials marked the Dane towns and monasteries. But these were imprecise. A cloudy day could render a sundial useless, and water clocks were finicky, prone to freezing in winter. Life was paced by church bells calling people to prayer, dividing the day into unequal hours that stretched and shrank with the seasons. An hour in the summer was much longer than an hour in the winter. Time belonged to nature and to God. Then, around the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a groundbreaking invention appeared in the clock towers of Europe, the mechanical clock. These early clocks were marvels of engineering, but also monstrously large and inaccurate. They were driven by heavy weights and regulated by a crude mechanism called a virgin foliot. Imagine a dumbbell-like bar spinning back and forth, slowly letting the gears turn. These clocks often lost or gained 15 minutes or more a day. They usually didn't even have a minute hand. just a single-hour hand circling a 24-hour dial. Their main job was to automatically strike a bell, signaling the hour to the entire town. They were less about personal time management and more about bringing order to the community. But as the Renaissance dawned, with its explosion of art, science, and humanism, the desire for precision grew. Thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci weren't just painting masterpieces. They were dissecting the world, trying to understand how everything worked from the human body to the cosmos. And to understand the world, you need to be able to measure it accurately. Time was no exception. Clockmakers, the unsung geniuses of their day, began refining these mechanical behemoths. They were the high-tech engineers of the 14th and 15th centuries. Slowly, improvements were made. The goal was to create a more consistent, reliable beat. It's this quest for regularity that began to separate time from the natural world. Instead of the sun's variable path, we now had the steady, rhythmic tick-toe of a machine. This was a radical shift. Time was becoming standardized, abstract, and mechanical. This new mechanical time began to seep into every aspect of Renaissance life. In bustling merchant cities like Florence and Venice, time literally became money. The precise scheduling of business appointments, the timing of shipments, the calculation of interest, rates, all of this relied on a shared, accurate understanding of time. The mechanical clock was the engine of this burgeoning capitalist economy. It allowed for coordination and efficiency on a scale never before seen. Work was no longer from sunup to sundown. It was measured in hours, and workers were paid for their time. This is an idea that we take completely for granted today, but it was revolutionary back then. It also changed warfare. Coordinating troop movements and synchronizing attacks required precise timing. The clock became a strategic tool. In the courts of kings and dukes, clocks became extravagant status symbols. They were intricate works of art, adorned with gold, silver, and automatable mechanical figures that would move and perform actions on the hour. Owning a magnificent clock wasn't just about telling time. It was a declaration of wealth, power, and a modern, scientific worldview. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the clock started to shrink, thanks to the invention of the mainspring, which stored energy like a coiled ribbon. Clocks no longer needed massive weights to power them. This was a game. Suddenly, clocks could be portable. They moved from the tower into the home, first as elaborate table clocks for the wealthy, and then, eventually, into the pocket. The invention of the pocket watch in the 16th century, though initially a luxury item for the super-rich, symbolized the ultimate privatization of time. Before, time was a public announcement boomed from a bell tower. Now, an individual could carry it with them. A person could literally hold time in their hand. This fostered a new sense of personal scheduling, discipline, and introspection. Time was no longer just a communal rhythm. It was a personal resource to be managed, saved, or wasted. The very idea of being on time or late for a personal appointment became a social norm. This new relationship with time is reflected in the art and literature of the period. Think of Shakespeare's plays, filled with references to fleeting time, deadlines, and the relentless march of the hours. Artists began including clocks and hourglasses in their paintings, known as vanitas paintings, to symbolize the transient nature of life and the inevitability of death. The clock became a powerful metaphor for human mortality. Its steady, indifferent ticking was a constant reminder that our time is finite. The scientific revolution, which blossomed out of the Renaissance, was profoundly dependent on this new concept of time. Astronomers like Galileo and later scientists like Isaac Newton needed precise instruments to measure the movement of planets and the laws of physics. The development of the pendulum clock in the mid-17th century by Christian Huygens provided an unprecedented level of accuracy, reducing errors from minutes per day to mere seconds. This precision was essential for the experiments and observations that would lay the foundation for modern science. The universe itself began to be seen as a giant, intricate clockwork mechanism created by a divine clockmaker. So, the next time you glance at your watch or your phone to check the time, take a moment, remember the Renaissance clockmakers and their clunky, wonderful machines. They did more than just invent a device to tell the hour. They created the very framework of modern life. They took the fluid, natural time of our ancestors and put it in a box, divided it into equal measurable units, and gave it to us to manage. They synchronized our world, enabled global commerce, powered scientific discovery, and gave us the very personal and sometimes stressful concept of time that governs our lives today. That simple tick-tock is the heartbeat of the modern world, a sound that echoes all the way back to the towers and workshops of the Renaissance. Now, we're journeying back in time to the heart of the Renaissance, a period of explosive creativity and intellectual rebirth. While we often think of grand cathedrals and breathtaking paintings, there's another, equally fascinating side to this era, the scientific workshop. And who better to guide us through this world than the ultimate Renaissance man himself, Leonardo da Vinci. When you hear the name Leonardo da Vinci, what comes to mind? Is it the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa, the divine drama of the Last Supper? These masterpieces rightly cemented his legacy as one of the greatest artists of all time. But to limit Leonardo to just a painter would be a massive understatement. He was an inventor, an engineer, a scientist, an anatomist, a geologist, a cartographer, a botanist. The list goes on. And the place where all these identities converged, where art and science danced together, was his workshop or bottega. Now, the Renaissance workshop wasn't just a quiet studio where an artist worked alone. It was a bustling hub of activity, a collaborative space teeming with apprentices, assistants, and fellow masters. Think of it as a cross between a modern-day startup incubator, a university research lab, and an art school, all rolled into one. Here, knowledge wasn't just stored in books. It was created, tested, and shared. Leonardo ran several workshops throughout his life, in Florence, Milan, and later in Rome and France. These weren't just places for grinding pigments and stretching canvases. They were laboratories of innovation. Picture this. In one corner, an apprentice is meticulously learning the art of sfumato, the smoky blending technique that gives Leonardo's paintings their lifelike quality. In another, a group is huddled over blueprints for a flying machine, debating the principles of aerodynamics by studying the flight of birds. This interdisciplinary approach was Leonardo's secret weapon. He didn't see a dividing line between art and science. To him, they were two sides of the same coin, both ways of observing and understanding the world. He believed that to paint a human figure accurately, you had to understand the muscles and bones beneath the skin. This conviction led him to one of the most controversial yet groundbreaking aspects of his work: human dissection. In an age when such practices were heavily restricted and viewed with suspicion, Leonardo obtained permission to dissect human corpses. His workshops became makeshift anatomy theaters. With scalpel in hand, he peeled back the layers of the human body, producing hundreds of incredibly detailed drawings. These weren't just for medical curiosity. He was studying how the body worked, how muscles contract, how the heart pumps blood. His anatomical drawings were so precise that they remained some of the most accurate available for centuries. He was essentially writing the visual textbook for human anatomy, driven by his desire to portray the human form with unparalleled realism. But his curiosity didn't stop at the human body. It extended to everything. His notebooks, thousands of pages of which survive today, are a testament to his restless mind. They are filled with sketches of plants, animals, rock formations, and swirling water. He designed bridges, military weapons like armored tanks and giant crossbows, and even hydraulic systems for canals. His workshop was where these ideas took shape. He and his team would build models, test prototypes, and constantly refine their designs. Imagine the atmosphere in that workshop. The air would be thick with the smell of linseed oil, wood shaving, and maybe even the faint, metallic scent of metal being worked. The sounds would be a symphony of creation. The gentle scratching of charcoal on paper, the rhythmic hammering of a sculptor's chisel, the excited chatter of minds brainstorming the next big invention. It was a place where failure was just a step toward discovery. Many of Leonardo's grandest inventions, like his flying machine, never actually took off. But the process of trying, of experimenting, pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. Leonardo's method was all about direct observation. His motto was saper vedir, which means knowing how. To see, he encouraged his students not just to look, but to truly see, to analyze, to question, and to document. He was a firm believer in empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from sensory experience. This was a radical departure from the medieval reliance on ancient texts and religious dogma. Leonardo and his contemporaries were ushering in a new age of scientific inquiry, one where the natural world was the ultimate authority. His workshops were also commercial enterprises. They produced paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts for wealthy patrons, dukes, and even the King of France. This practical need to earn a living fueled the artistic side of the bottega. But for Leonardo, even a commissioned portrait was an opportunity for scientific study, a chance to explore the psychology of the sitter, the play of light on their features, and the intricate anatomy beneath. The legacy of Leonardo's workshops is immense. They were crucibles of the Renaissance spirit, places where the seeds of the scientific revolution were sown. He trained a new generation of artists and thinkers who carried his methods forward. More importantly, he championed a way of thinking that is more relevant today than ever before: the integration of different fields of knowledge. In our modern world, we often place subjects into neat little boxers, Archie over airy science, over there. Leonardo's workshop teaches us the power of breaking down those walls. He showed that a deep understanding of anatomy makes you a better artist. A keen eye for natural patterns can inspire engineering breakthroughs. Creativity and analytical thinking are not opposing forces. They are partners in innovation. So the next time you marvel at a painting by Leonardo da Vinci, remember that it's more than just a beautiful image. It's the product of a mind that saw the universe as a single, interconnected masterpiece. It's the culmination of countless hours of observation, experimentation, and collaboration that took place in one of the most extraordinary scientific workshops the world has ever known. He taught us that the greatest tool we have is our own curiosity, and that the world is a laboratory waiting to be explored. Have you ever stood in front of a grand Renaissance building and felt a sense of perfect harmony and balance? That feeling isn't just an accident of history. It's the result of pure, unadulterated mathematics. Now, we're going on a journey back in time, from the 14th to the 17th century to uncover the hidden mathematical secrets behind the masterpieces of Renaissance architecture. Forget dusty textbooks. This is the story of how numbers, ratios, and geometry created some of the most beautiful structures the world has ever seen. So, what was the big deal with math during the Renaissance? Well, it was everything. Thinkers and artists of the era were obsessed with the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome. They rediscovered texts from figures like Euclid, Pythagoras, and Vitruvius. These ancient masters believed that the universe was governed by mathematical laws and that beauty itself could be expressed through numbers. For Renaissance architects, this was a revelation. They saw mathematics not just as a tool for building, but as a divine language, a way to connect their creations to the very order of the cosmos. Building a church wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was about creating a slice of heaven on earth, using the same mathematical principles that God used to create the universe. This powerful idea is the key to understanding everything that follows. Let's start with the most famous ratio in art and architecture, the golden ratio. It's a special number, approximately 1.618, and it's found everywhere in nature, from the spiral of a seashell to the branching of trees. Renaissance architects believed this ratio was the epitome of natural beauty and harmony. They used it to determine the proportions of entire buildings. For example, the relationship between the height of a facade and its width would often adhere to the golden ratio. This created a sense of visual satisfaction, a feeling that everything was exactly as it should be. It's the subconscious recognition of a natural, pleasing pattern that makes these buildings feel so balanced and right. You can see it in the windows, the doors, and the overall layout. It was like they had a secret formula for beauty, and the golden ratio was a key ingredient. Now, let's talk about the man who literally gave a human face to this idea. Vitruvius and his famous Vitruvian Man, immortalized by Leonardo da Vinci. Vitruvius was a Roman architect who proposed that an ideal building should reflect the proportions of the human body. He famously described how a perfectly proportioned man could fit inside both a circle and a square. For Renaissance architects, this was profound. The circle represented the divine, the spiritual, the infinite. The square represented the terrestrial, the stable, the human world. Da Vinci's drawing wasn't just a cool sketch. It was a philosophical statement. It showed that man was the link between the earthly and the divine. Architects took this idea and ran with it. They designed churches with floor plans based on the circle, representing God's perfection, and superimposed a square grid over it, representing human order. This fusion of circle and square, of the divine and the human, became a central theme in their designs, making their buildings not just structures, but symbols of humanity's place in the universe. And you couldn't talk about Renaissance architecture without mentioning symmetry and geometry. These guys were masters of it. Symmetry wasn't just about making one side of a building a mirror image of the other. It was a principle of order and rationality. A symmetrical facade created a sense of stability, calm, and grandeur. They used simple geometric shape circles, squares, triangles as the building blocks of their designs. A dome is essentially a hemisphere, a rotated semicircle. An arch is a section of a circle. The floor plans of many Renaissance villas and palaces are based on a grid of interconnected squares and rectangles. Why? Because these shapes were seen as pure and perfect. They were understandable, logical, and reflected the rational mind of man. Using them was a way to impose order and clarity onto the chaotic world, creating spaces that felt peaceful and intellectually satisfying. Let's look at a concrete example. The Florence Cathedral, with its legendary dome, designed by Filippo Bruni. This wasn't just an architectural challenge. It was a mathematical puzzle of epic proportions. No one had built a dome that large since antiquity, and the technology had been lost. Brunelleschi, a trained goldsmith and a mathematical genius, had to essentially reinvent the process. He didn't just guess. He used precise mathematical calculations. He designed a double-shelled dome with an inner and outer layer to reduce weight. He devised a new herringbone brick pattern to distribute the stress, preventing the bricks from collapsing inward during construction. And he invented entirely new cranes and hoisting machines, all based on principles of gears, pulleys, and counterweights pure applied mechanics and math. The dome wasn't just built, it was calculated. It stands today as a testament to the power of mathematics to solve seemingly impossible engineering problems. It's a triumph of human ingenuity, powered by numbers. Another giant of the era was Leon Battista Alberti. He wasn't just an architect. He was a true Renaissance man, a writer, a theorist, and a mathematician. He literally wrote the book on architecture, called On the Art of Building. In it, he argued that beauty is the harmony of all parts, in whatsoever subject it appears, fitted together with such proportion and connection that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered, but for the worse. How do you achieve that harmony? Through mathematics. Of course, for Alberti, the architect was a scholar, not just a builder. He had to understand geometry, perspective, and proportion. A great example of his philosophy is the facade of the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence. He was tasked with finishing a pre-existing Gothic church. His solution was pure mathematical genius. He used a system of squares and harmonic proportions to create a design that was both classical in its harmony and respectful of the older structure. He used scrolls to gracefully connect the wide lower section with the narrow upper section, a problem that had stumped architects for years. His solution was so elegant and mathematically sound that it became a model for church facades for centuries to come. Then there's the master of the High Renaissance, Donato Bram, and his vision for the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His original plan was the ultimate expression of mathematical idealism. He designed a church based on a perfect Greek cross with 4 arms of equal length, all topped by a massive central dome inspired by the Pantheon. The entire design was based on a series of interconnecting squares and circles. It was the Vitruvian Man concept on an architectural scaled-up perfect fusion of the square earthly and the circle divine. Although his design was later modified by others, including Michelangelo, Bramante's initial concept set the stage. It established the core idea that the grandest church in Christendom should be a physical embodiment of divine mathematical perfection. His Tempietto in Rome, a small chapel, is often called the perfect Renaissance building. It's a tiny structure, but it's a masterclass in proportion, geometry, and classical harmony, a small-scale model of his cosmic vision. And we can't forget Andrea Palladio. His influence stretched far beyond the Renaissance, even reaching America and inspiring buildings like the White House. Palladio was obsessed with symmetry and classical proportions. He developed what are now known as Palladian villas, country houses known for their strict symmetry and designs based on Roman temple fronts. He published his own book, The 4 Books of Architecture, which was filled with his designs and the mathematical principles behind them. He had a system of harmonic proportions for room dimensions. For example, the height of a room would be related to its length and width through simple integer ratios like 3 to 4 to 5. This was based on the musical theory of harmony, believing that the ratios that create pleasing sounds could also create pleasing spaces. When you walk into a Palladian room, you feel a sense of calm and order, because the space itself is a kind of frozen music built on a foundation of mathematical harmony. So, as we've seen, the great buildings of the Renaissance are far more than just beautiful old structures. They are intellectual achievements. They are the physical result of a profound belief that the universe is rational, ordered, and knowable through mathematics. Architects like Brunelleschi, Alberti, and Palladio were not just artists. They were mathematicians, engineers, and philosophers who encoded their beliefs into stone, brick, and mortar. They used the golden ratio, principles of symmetry, and simple geometry to create a sense of harmony that we can still feel today. They looked to the human body and the cosmos for inspiration, uniting the earthly and the divine through the language of numbers. The next time you see a Renaissance building, look closer. Look for the squares, the circles, the perfect proportions. You're not just looking at a building. You're looking at a mathematical masterpiece, a timeless equation for beauty. Now, we're embarking on a journey back in time, not just to one continent, but across a vast ocean to witness one of history's most transformative moments. We're diving into the Renaissance, that incredible period of rebirth in Europe, and exploring how its spirit of curiosity and ambition led to the discovery and exploration of the Americas. This isn't just a story of ships and maps. It's a story of a monumental clash of cultures, a story that reshaped the world forever. So grab your explorer's hat and let's set sail into the 15th century, the Renaissance. Spanning from the 14th to the 17th century was a fervent period of cultural, artistic, and intellectual revival in Europe. It was a time when the old ways of the Middle Ages were being questioned. Humanism, a philosophy that emphasized human potential and achievements, was gaining ground. Thinkers and artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo weren't just creating masterpieces. They were embodying a new spirit of inquiry. This very spirit, this thirst for knowledge and glory, couldn't be contained within the borders of Europe. It yearned to see what lay beyond the known horizon. At the same time, practical needs were driving this push outwards. The Ottoman Empire's control over traditional trade routes to the East made spices, silk, and other valuable goods incredibly expensive for Europeans. Nations like Portugal and Spain, situated on the Atlantic coast, were perfectly positioned to seek new maritime routes to Asia. They were developing advanced sailing technologies, like the Caravella light, fast, and maneuverable ship end, improving navigational tools like the astrolabe and the magnetic compass. The stage was set. The motives were clear: God, gold, and glory. Spreading Christianity, finding immense wealth, and achieving personal and national fame were the powerful engines driving these expeditions. And then, in 1492, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, made a fateful miscalculation. Believing he could reach Asia by sailing west, he stumbled upon a world entirely unknown to Europeans. He landed not in the East Indies, but in the Bahamas. This single event kicked off a frenzy of exploration. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro followed, driven by tales of golden cities, courts with just a few hundred men, managed to topple the mighty Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. Pizarro did the same to the vast and sophisticated Inca Empire in Peru. Their methods were often brutal, a combination of military superiority, strategic alliances with rival native groups, and, most devastatingly, the unintentional introduction of European diseases. Before we talk about the consequences, let us pause to appreciate the sheer complexity of the Americas before 1492. This was not an empty land. It was home to millions of people with rich and diverse cultures. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest and most impressive cities in the world, a marvel of engineering built on a lake. The Inca Empire was connected by a stunningly complex road system that rivaled that of the Romans. From the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley to the agricultural societies of the Amazon, the Americas were a tapestry of civilizations, languages, and traditions that had been developing for thousands of years. The arrival of Europeans wasn't a discovery, it was an encounter, and for these civilizations, it was an invasion that would change their destiny forever. The immediate cultural consequence of this encounter was nothing short of catastrophic for the indigenous populations. The most lethal weapon the Europeans brought was not the sword or the cannon, but the germs they carried. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity, spread like wildfire. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out in the decades following contact. Entire cultures vanished, languages were lost, and vast amounts of accumulated knowledge disappeared forever. This demographic collapse is one of the greatest tragedies in human history, a silent apocalypse that cleared the way for European colonization. For the survivors, life was irrevocably altered. The Spanish and Portuguese implemented systems of forced labor like the encomienda and meta systems, essentially enslaving native populations to work in mines and on plantations. Their social structures were shattered, their leaders were overthrown, and their religious practices were suppressed. Catholic missionaries arrived, determined to convert the heathen populations. While some missionaries genuinely tried to protect the indigenous people from the worst abuses, the overall effect was the erosion of native spiritual traditions. Temples were torn down and churches were built on their ruins, symbolizing the physical and spiritual conquest of a people. But this exchange was not a one-way street. The encounter, often called the Columbian Exchange, also profoundly transformed Europe. The Americas introduced a host of new crops to the Old World that would revolutionize diets and agriculture globally. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes, or Irish history without the potato, or Belgian chocolate without cacao? All of these, along with corn, peppers, peanuts, and vanilla, came from the Americas. These hicalari, easily grown crops, led to a population boom in Europe, Africa, and Asia, fueling further economic and social change. The world's menu was permanently expanded. Beyond food, the Americas flooded Europe with unimaginable wealth, particularly silver. The vast silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia bankrolled the Spanish Empire for a century, funding its armies and its ambitions. This massive influx of silver, however, also led to rampant inflation across Europe, an economic event known as the Price Revolution. It destabilized economies, but also spurred the growth of capitalism as new banking and investment systems arose to manage this newfound wealth. The economic center of Europe shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic nations, empowering Spain, Portugal, England, and France. The intellectual impact on Renaissance Europe was also immense. The discovery of a whole new continent and its peoples shattered the classical, biblically based worldview. The earth was bigger and more complex than anyone had imagined. New plants, new animals, and new human societies had to be explained and incorporated into their understanding of the world. This challenge to old certainties fueled the scientific revolution, encouraging a spirit of empirical observation and questioning. The idea of the noble savage, a romanticized view of indigenous people living in harmony with nature, emerged in European thought, influencing philosophers like Montaigne and later Rousseau, and making Europeans question their own societies. Of course, the Columbian Exchange had a darker side for another continent, Africa. As native populations dwindled due to disease and overwork, European colonizers looked for a new source of labor to work their lucrative sugar and silver plantations. This created the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Over the next few centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly captured, torn from their homes, and shipped across the Atlantic in brutal conditions to endure a lifetime of slavery. This trade not only caused immeasurable suffering and depopulated entire regions of Africa, but it also laid the foundation for a racially based social hierarchy in the Americas that continues to have profound and painful consequences to this day. The wealth of the New World was, in large part, built on the backs of enslaved Africans. So, as we look back, the Renaissance-era exploration of the Americas was a multifaceted event of epic proportions. It was born from a European spirit of adventure and ambition, but it resulted in a collision of worlds with vastly unequal outcomes. It led to the tragic downfall of ancient American civilizations and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. But it also initiated the first truly global age, connecting continents, peoples, and ecosystems that had been separate for millennia. It reshaped economies, diets, and a collective human understanding of the planet. The legacy of this era is all around us, in the food we eat, the languages we speak, and the complex, multicultural societies we live in today. It's a reminder that history is never simple, and that the quest for discovery always comes with profound and often painful responsibilities. When you think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Masterpieces like the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's David? Right. We imagine artists in dusty smocks, brush in hand, bringing divine visions to life. But what if I told you these weren't just art studios? They were some of the most advanced chemical laboratories of their time. Forget test tubes and beakers for a moment. The real revolution in experimental chemistry wasn't happening in a dedicated lab, but right there on the painter's palette. Let's travel back to the 14th century. Before the Renaissance, artists had a pretty limited toolkit. They mostly used ectempera, a mixture of egg yolk and ground pigments. It dried incredibly fast and was difficult to blend, which is why a lot of medieval art has that flat, distinct look. If an artist wanted a specific color, they often had to rely on whatever a supplier could provide. There was no standard, no consistency. Imagine trying to paint a masterpiece when your red looks different every single time you buy it. Frustrating, right? This is where the story gets interesting. The artists of the Renaissance were more than just painters. They were innovators, engineers, and yes, chemists. They were obsessed with realism. They wanted to capture the world as it truly was, with all its light, shadow, and depth. The old methods just wouldn't cut it. They needed new materials, new techniques, and to get them, they had to invent them. This hunger for better materials turned their workshops into bustling hubs of experimentation. They weren't just mixing colors, they were transforming substances. They were pioneers in what we now call materials science. They documented their recipes and findings in detailed handbooks. One of the most famous is Sinino Sinini's Il Libro di Arte, or the Craftsman's Handbook. Reading it today feels like flipping through a medieval chemistry textbook. Sonini gives step-by-step instructions on how to do everything. How to make your own brushes, how to prepare a wooden panel for painting, and most importantly, how to create your own pigments. And this wasn't simple stuff. Take the color blue, for example. Ultramarine blue was the most prized pigment, more valuable than gold. It was made by grinding the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli, which was mined exclusively in a single region of Afghanistan. The process of extracting the pure blue pigment from the stone was a complex, multi-step chemical process involving wax, resin, and lye. It was a closely guarded secret, and only the most skilled artist chemists could pull it off. Mastering this process meant you could create breathtakingly vibrant blues that made your paintings stand out. And it also meant you had a serious commercial advantage. But the real game changer was the widespread adoption of oil paint. While oil-based paints had been around, Renaissance artists, particularly in Northern Europe, like Jan van Eyck, perfected the formula. They experimented with different types of oils, linseed, walnut, poppy, and discovered how each one affected the paint's properties. Linseed oil, for instance, created a strong, durable film, while walnut oil yellowed less over time. This was a massive leap forward. Unlike fast-drying tempera, oil paint dried slowly. This gave artists time to blend color seamlessly, to create soft transitions, and to build up layers of translucent glazer. This technique, called sfumato, is what gives Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa her famously mysterious, smoky quality. It allowed for a level of realism and emotional depth that was simply impossible before. To control the drying time and consistency, artists became masters of additives. They would add small amounts of metal salts, like lead oxide, which acted as catalysts to speed up the drying process. They were, without knowing the modern terminology, practicing polymer chemistry. The workshop became a place of fire and fumes. To create pigments, they would heat metals and minerals in furnaces. Making lead white, a brilliant and opaque white, involved corroding lead strips with vinegar vapor. It was a toxic and dangerous process, but it produced a pigment that was essential for capturing the play of light. To create verde gris, a vibrant gris, they would suspend copper plates over vats of acid. To get a rich yellow, they might heat lead and tin together to form lead tin yellow. Every color had its own recipe, its own chemical secret. These artists were meticulous observers. They documented how different pigments reacted with each other, which ones were stable and which ones faded over time. They understood that you couldn't mix a lead-based white with a sulfur-based pigment like because it would turn black over time. This was practical chemistry, learned through trial, error, and shared knowledge. They weren't guided by atomic theory, but by empirical evidence. They asked, what happens if I mix this with that? And how can I make this color brighter or last longer? This is the very essence of the scientific method: observation, experimentation, and documentation. Think about Leonardo da Vinci. We remember him as an artist, but he was equally a scientist. His notebooks are filled with studies of anatomy, engineering, and the properties of light. When he painted The Last Supper, he wasn't content with the traditional fresco method. He wanted the luminosity of oil paint on a dry wall. So, he invented a new technique, applying a mix of oil and tempera directly onto a specially prepared surface. Now, Tragically, his experiment was a failure in the long run. The paint didn't adhere properly to the wall and began flaking off within his lifetime. But the ambition behind it is what's key. He was pushing the boundaries, treating the wall not just as a canvas, but as a chemical experiment. This mindset, this fusion of art and science, was everywhere. Albrecht Dürer, the German master, wrote extensively on geometry and proportion. But he was also deeply involved in the mechanics of printmaking, another field requiring deep knowledge of metals, acids, and inks. The knowledge generated in these workshops didn't stay there. Apprentices learned the secrets from their masters and carried them to new cities and new workshops. Guilds regulated the quality of materials, creating a shared standard of excellence. This network of knowledge sharing was a precursor to modern scientific communities, where discoveries are peer-reviewed and built upon by others. So, why does this matter? It shows us that the neat division we often make between art and science is a relatively modern invention. For the masters of the Renaissance, they were two sides of the same coin. Both were ways of understanding and representing the world. The desire to create more beautiful, more realistic art directly fueled chemical innovation. The artist's studio was the crucible where new materials were forged, and in the process, it laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. Every time they ground a mineral, boiled an oil, or purified a pigment, they were performing a chemical experiment. They were learning about oxidation, catalysis, and chemical reactivity, even if they didn't have the words for it. They were driven by an artistic vision, but their methods were purely scientific. So, the next time you're in a museum, standing in front of a Renaissance masterpiece, take a closer look. Don't just see the brushstrokes. See the centuries of experimentation behind them. See the brilliant, dangerous, and revolutionary chemistry that made it all possible. These paintings aren't just art. They are a testament to a time when art and science were inseparable. A time when the painter's palette was the cutting edge of human discovery. Now, we're journeying back in time to the Renaissance, a period of incredible rebirth in art, science, and culture. But we're not just looking at the famous paintings and sculptures. We're diving deeper into something that made all that art possible: the revolutionary understanding of light and vision. Imagine you're living in the 14th century. For 1,000 years, the dominant idea about how we see, inherited from ancient thinkers like Euclid and Ptolemy, was the emission theory. It suggested that our eyes shot out invisible rays, like tiny little flashlights, and when these rays hit an object, we could see it. It sounds a bit strange to us now, right? But it was the best explanation they had for centuries. People believed our sight was an active force, something we projected out into the world. But as the Renaissance dawned, a new spirit of inquiry began to challenge these old ideas. This wasn't just about art. It was about observing the world with fresh eyes. One of the earliest and most influential figures in this shift was an Arab scholar named Al-Hasan, whose work, written centuries earlier, was rediscovered and translated in Europe. His book of optics was a game changer. Al-Hasan argued for the opposite of the emission theory. He proposed the intromission theory, suggesting that light travels from a source like the sun, bounces off objects, and then enters our eyes. We don't send out rays, we receive them. This might seem like a simple switch, but its implications were massive. It meant the vision was a passive process, dependent on the physical properties of light itself. Al-Hasan didn't just theorize, he experimented. He used a camera obscura, a darkened room with a tiny pinhole, to demonstrate how light travels in straight lines and forms an inverted image on the opposite wall. This was concrete, observable proof. Seeing an upside-down image projected by light alone was a powerful argument that something was entering the eye, not leaving it. As these ideas spread through Renaissance Europe, they ignited the minds of artists and thinkers alike. They weren't just painters anymore. They were scientists of light. They became obsessed with how light behaved. How does it create shadows? How does it reflect off different surfaces like water or metal? How does it make colors appear brighter or duller? This wasn't just for artistic effect. It was a quest for realism, for capturing the world as it truly appeared. Enter the titans of the High Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man, filled thousands of pages in his notebooks with meticulous studies of light, shadow, and human anatomy. He dissected eyes, trying to understand the physical mechanism of sight. He observed how light diffused in the atmosphere, creating what he called sfumato, that soft, hazy, smoke-like quality you see in the background of the Mona Lisa. He understood that distant objects appear less distinct and bluer in color, a principle we now call atmospheric perspective. For Leonardo, art and science were inseparable. To paint the world, you first had to understand it. He conducted experiments with candles and spheres to map out how light and shadow, or chiaroscuro, could create the illusion of three-dimensional form on a flat surface. He noted that a shadow is not just a patch of blackness but has a core, the umbra, and a softer edge, the penumbra. This detailed observation allowed him to give his figures a weight and volume that felt incredibly lifelike. He was, in essence, reverse engineering reality. Then you have artists like Albrecht Dürer in Germany. Dürer was fascinated by the mathematical principles behind art. He created intricate woodcuts and engravings, showing artists using mechanical devices to perfect their use of perspective. These perspective machines used strings and frames to help artists accurately map a three-dimensional scene onto a two-dimensional plane. This was a direct application of the idea that light travels in straight lines from the object to the artist, as art was becoming a science governed by laws and geometry. The quest to understand vision wasn't just for artists. The scientific revolution was gaining momentum. In the early 17th century, the astronomer Johannes Kepler took the next giant leap, building on the work of Alhazen and others. Kepler was the first to correctly explain how the eye's lens focuses light onto the retina at the back of the eye. He was the one who confirmed that the image formed on the retina is, just like in the camera obscura, upside down and reversed. This was a monumental discovery. It solved the puzzle of how light gets into the eye, but it created a new one. If the image on our retina is inverted, why do we see the world upright? Kepler, being a physicist, wisely left that part of the puzzle for others to solve, suggesting it was the job of the soul or the mind to correct the image. We now know, of course, that our brain performs this incredible feat of processing automatically. But Kepler had laid the final, crucial piece of the optical puzzle. He had provided the correct anatomical and physical model of the eye as an optical instrument. This new understanding had profound effects. It demystified vision. It was no longer a magical, spiritual power emanating from us, but a physical process that could be studied, understood, and even corrected. This line of inquiry led directly to the development of better eyeglasses, telescopes, and microscopes instruments that would expand our vision from the microscopic to the cosmic. Galileo, a contemporary of Kepler, turned his telescope to the heavens and changed our place in the universe forever, all thanks to this fundamental understanding of optics. So, the next time you look at a Renaissance masterpiece, like a painting by Caravaggio with its dramatic, intense lighting, or a Leonardo with its subtle, lifelike atmosphere, remember that you're not just seeing a beautiful image. You're seeing the culmination of a scientific revolution. You're seeing the work of artists who were also scientists, obsessively studying the nature of light and the mechanics of sight. They weren't just painting what they saw. They were painting how they saw. This incredible fusion of art and science during the Renaissance completely transformed our perception of the world. It taught us that to represent reality, we must first understand its underlying principles. The journey from mysterious I-beams to the retinal image is a perfect example of the Renaissance spirit. A shift from ancient dogma to direct observation, experimentation, and a relentless curiosity that continues to drive science and art to this day. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the light of the Renaissance. If you found this fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the history of art and science. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next video. We'll see you in the next one. Close your eyes and let the comforting fire sounds drift you into a tranquil dreamland.